Back in the late 19th century, there were a few railroad companies that dominated the area of South Brooklyn. You had four of them that would eventually become the Sea Beach, West End, Culver, and Brighton lines. Then, you had the New York and Manhattan Beach Railway, which consists of the present-day Bay Ridge branch and the now-abandoned Manhattan Beach branch. You even had the Coney Island and Brooklyn Railroad operating horse cars to the island it was named after. However, there are two other railroad companies that are quite obscure because, well, most New Yorkers just don't know about it, but they do still have tracks that are in operation. If you ever took a stroll down First Avenue in Sunset Park, you have most likely seen rails embedded into the street pavement. Today, I'm going to talk about why they exist and what they were for. So, the tracks that I'm talking about are actually owned by two different railroad companies, the South Brooklyn Railroad and the New York New Jersey Railroad. I'll start with the history of the former. On September 30th, 1887, the South Brooklyn Railroad and Terminal Company was incorporated from 9th Avenue and 38th Street, where the Brooklyn, Bath, and West End Railroad or the West End Line terminated at. The line would then go west to the very end of 38th Street. Now, the South Brooklyn was not necessarily a true railroad per se, and it didn't even have any train cars or locomotives. Instead, it purchased city blocks so it could lease it to other railroad companies. For example, the South Brooklyn was leased to the BBWE, allowing the latter's trains to connect to a ferry terminal at 39th Street. In 1890, the South Brooklyn and Terminal Railroad was combined with the Prospect Park and Coney Island Railroad. In 1893, they were both bought under the Long Island Railroad. Now the LAR was still operating steam locomotives at the time, but the South Brooklyn's track didn't allow for that, so in 1899, the line was electrified. In December 1899, the South Brooklyn and Terminal Railroad Company ceased operations, and it was reorganized into the South Brooklyn Railway on January 13, 1900. On August 31, 1902, the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company took control of the South Brooklyn, but the LAR still ran trains on the line for a few more years. The BRT would only run passenger operations, while freight operations would be handed to the Brooklyn Heights Railroad. Some freight that was delivered on the line included mail, lumber, cement, stone, ashes, pipes, marble, and granite. By now, the South Brooklyn Railway was running along 2nd Avenue in the north end and all the way to Avenue X under the Culver Line in the south end. On February 28, 1907, the South Brooklyn Railroad and the Brooklyn Heights Railroad split, but both were still under the BRT's control. The South Brooklyn Railway was actually a separate subsidiary, meaning that the BRT wouldn't be able to be placed under the Interstate Commerce Commission, preventing the South Brooklyn from being under government regulation. In 1909, it discontinued its use of the 3rd Avenue Yard. Instead, they preferred to build a new terminal on the property of the New York and Sea Beach Railroad. The South Brooklyn Railway would also use the Culver Depot, which was previously used by the Prospect Park and Coney Island Railroad. This gave the South Brooklyn access to Coney Island itself. In 1913, all freight operations that the BRT controlled were now under the South Brooklyn Railway. Now, 1913 of course introduced the dual contracts, which would elevate and construct new BRT subway lines. The route of the South Brooklyn Railway helped in their construction, as materials could be transported on the line. A temporary connection at 38th Street and 4th Avenue was built to allow equipment transported on the South Brooklyn to be delivered to the construction site on the 4th Avenue line. In June of 1922, the South Brooklyn Railway began buying out the Prospect Park and Coney Island Railroad. By 1923, the Culver Line was fully merged with the South Brooklyn. During this time, the BRT was reorganized into the Brooklyn Manhattan Transit, but still had control over the South Brooklyn Railway. On June 1, 1940, the railway was transferred over to the New York City Board of Transportation, along with the entire New York City subway. In the same year, the South Brooklyn saw an increase in traffic due to World War II. The company also got hold of some trucks to more directly deliver freight to people. After the war ended, they purchased 2 diesel locomotives in 1946. On June 15, 1953, the company was transferred over to the New York Transit Authority. On Halloween of that year, passenger service on McDonald Avenue, that is, the section running under the Culver Line, ceased passenger operations, and so it was only used for freight from then on. On December 27, 1961, the entire South Brooklyn Railway was de-electrified, now only running diesel trains on the line. Now, during the first 3 decades following the Second World War, trucks became a rising factor in freight transportation. This made use of freight trains less and less vital, which affected the South Brooklyn Railway. In 1978, the McDonald Avenue section was completely abandoned and paved over by 1991. After this, trains were stored on the 38th Street Yard, adjacent to the 9th Avenue station on the West End Line. To do this, there was a track connection from the South Brooklyn to the West End Line on the 4th Avenue. In 1994, the very last railroad company, not affiliated with the city, used the South Brooklyn Railway one last time. From then on, the lines would just be used to transport subway cars or locomotives. Now, the line had connections to the rest of the American Rail network through the 65th Street Yard, but to get there, trains had to run onto track owned by the New York and New Jersey Railroad, which is the other company I'm going to talk about. Now unfortunately, I looked forever but I couldn't find the exact year which this track was built, but I can give an estimate. The New York New Jersey Railroad succeeded the New York Cross Harbor Railroad, which in itself was comprised of 3 railroad companies, the Brooklyn East District Terminal Company, the Bush Terminal Railroad, and the New York Dock Railway. These companies arose during the late 1800s and the early 1900s, so it's safe to say that this line along First Avenue was constructed around that time. Now, I also couldn't really find much info on the history of the actual line itself, so sorry about that. However, I did find out that the Bush Terminal Railroad did own the line by 1917. Now, as for those companies I just mentioned, I'm thinking that they deserve to be saved for another video, as they have some history themselves. But long story short, they serve the purpose of a business known as car floating, in which barges with rails attached to them would carry train cars across water. So, at the docks of these companies, they could receive or deliver outrolling stock. But anyways, I'm going to save all this for another time, and skip all the way to the railroad that currently owns this track, the New York-New Jersey Railroad. This company came from its predecessor, the New York Cross Harbor Railroad. In 2006, the Mid-Atlantic New England Railroad bought out this company and renamed it to New York-New Jersey Rail. The city then bought out the NYNJ 2 years later. This line was starting to fall into a state of disrepair, and so the Port Authority began work on improving the NYNJ's transfer bridges, float bridges, and the infrastructure of the track in Brooklyn. This would all take $118.1 million to complete. In July of 2012, the company began using the 65th Street Yard, the terminus of the New York and Atlantic Railroad's Bay Ridge branch. The tracks along First Avenue were refurbished, and new tracks were laid to help with service at the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal of the South Brooklyn Railway. On October 29, 2012, Hurricane Sandy swept through the city, causing structural damage, especially to the Greenville facility the NYNJ was utilizing. Service to this facility was restored after 52 days. On the 17th of September 2014, the Port Authority announced a redevelopment of the Greenville facility, which included transfer bridges, car float bridges, and new low-emission locomotives. In July of 2017, the Port Authority announced a $35 million study to construct a cross-harbor rail tunnel, which will connect Long Island to New Jersey by train. However, nothing of the tunnel has been built yet at the time of recording this video. The cross-harbor rail tunnel has quite a bit of history to it, so maybe I'll make a video about it in the future. So that does it for the history side of things. Now I'm going to walk along the trackage of the South Brooklyn Railway and the New York-New Jersey Rail. So, at the point where the D train emerges out onto the open in Sunset Park, the start of the remaining section of the South Brooklyn is nearby. On the other side of 4th Avenue, those tracks begin. However, you can still see through the tunnel that goes under 4th Avenue and see the West End line. This means that as you're on a Coney Island bound D train, look right as you emerge outside to see the tracks of the South Brooklyn Railway. Now, these tracks are running between 38th and 39th Street, and initially, you have to look down to see the tracks in an open cut area. However, as you're crossing under the Gowanus Expressway, the tracks become grade level, meaning that they now run on street surface. After this, the track becomes sort of difficult to see, because an exit off the expressway is blocking your view. However, as you near the Costco, you can start to see more of it. Now it's here along 2nd Avenue, in which you can start to locate the open areas of where the various car float terminals would have been at. You can also see the track continuing into the empty spot. Again, I will be discussing those terminals in later videos. Now, you can also see remnants of rails continuing along 2nd Avenue itself, as it branches off into other buildings. This is because the railroad serves other businesses along the docks. Now, the main track then curves south to head along 1st Avenue. At this point, we are now in NYNJ territory. The track is off to the side here, until it eventually splits into multiple tracks, as there is a mini yard which is a little overgrown. It's also here where Bush Terminal once stood, with it being on the other side of the tracks. Actually, the former location of the terminal has been turned into a park, named Bush Terminal Park. However, there are no traces of the terminal or any tracks here. Oh, and just like the South Brooklyn, the NYNJ has tracks that curve off into other buildings. Now after this, the line becomes a single track once again, but it now runs in the middle of the street. Aside from the South Brooklyn, the New York-New Jersey Railroad is one of the only railroad companies in the city to run street-grade trains. The track then runs for another quarter of a mile, until after it crosses 58th Street when it suddenly runs into a building. This is the Brooklyn Army Terminal, opened in 1919, which, as the name suggests, was used to store military equipment for the US Army. Its history is something that I want to save for a future video, because it does have some quirks that are really interesting to explore. So, the track itself just runs straight through the terminal until it reaches the 65th Street Yard and the Bay Ridge branch. If you go to 2nd Avenue and look down onto the yard, you can see the track that curves right into the Brooklyn Army Terminal. The NYNJ serves the obvious purpose of bringing trains from the 65th Street Yard and car float to the South Brooklyn Railway, and then onto the New York City subway, or trains use the line to get from the South Brooklyn to the Bay Ridge branch. And so that's about it for these two freight train companies, which run trains on street grade level. Seeing railroad tracks on the street itself is quite unusual to me, considering that a lot of track right-of-ways in the city are either in tunnels, embankments, open cuts, or on elevated trestles. Still, there are more remnants of street-level tracks in New York City, so I will be making videos of them in the future. But anyways, if you did enjoy this video, then consider liking it and subscribing to my channel. I'll see you next time.